You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. What can local police do if they see federal officers violating a person's civil rights? Minnesota courts are reportedly overwhelmed by the number of civil rights lawsuits being filed by immigrants and observers interacting with ICE and CBP during Operation Metro Surge. Politico has documented more than 2,400 cases across the country in which judges have rejected the administration's detention policy. Examples that you may not have heard of include a Myanmar refugee who was nursing a 5-month-old, arrested and shipped to Texas, a Mexican man who sustained severe skull injuries during an arrest by ICE, and a Ukrainian refugee arrested for no apparent reason. Across our own state, local police departments have put out statements about what they can and cannot do when ICE comes to their communities. In the wake of the 2020 murder of George Floyd, many police departments were challenged to renew their focus on civil rights to avoid the kinds of use of force situations, shootings, injuries, and lawsuits that we see around ICE and Border Patrol right now. According to reporting by The Atlantic and The Wall Street Journal, that's led to a rift between federal agents and local departments as they see ICE using tactics previously denigrated by the Justice Department in the wake of George Floyd. But what are police officers able to do when confronting potential civil rights violations by federal agents? Tahir Duckett is the executive director for the Center for Innovations in Community Safety at Georgetown Law, and the center runs the ABLE Project, which teaches police how to intervene during civil rights violations by fellow law enforcement officers. Tahir, thank you very much for being here.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, what are you hearing right now from local law enforcement agencies around the country about ICE and civil rights?
Well, certainly one of the things that I am hearing a lot is that there is an enormous amount of stress being placed on local law enforcement who, in addition to their everyday duties, are now being called in to, in some ways, mediate some of the disputes that are happening between federal law enforcement and communities. Quite obviously, you see that happening day to day in Minneapolis, where the Minneapolis Police Department is fielding 911 calls, reporting kidnappings that they have to go and respond to. And it is creating a lot of stress on these departments, and it's eroding a lot of trust between those departments and their communities. A lot of departments that have tried to do a lot of work to rebuild trust in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and who are now really struggling with seeing how delicate that trust can be as federal law enforcement show up in neighborhoods with police plastered across their chest. It's not always clear that the kinds of things that they're doing are, I think for a lot of local community members, they don't necessarily know. Does police mean ICE? Does it mean CBP? Does it mean my local law enforcement? And that's creating a lot of problems for local law enforcement agencies.
I want to talk a bit about ABLE, about this training program that the center runs. What is ABLE and how did it get started?
Yeah, so after the murder of George Floyd, while 3 bystander officers stood by and watched, we took a look at the law, right, which has had a really clear constitutional duty to intervene. It means that law enforcement have a constitutional duty to intervene to prevent harm by their fellow officers. And that's why you actually saw some of those law enforcement officers, not just Derek Chauvin, but the other officers who were on the scene, could be held accountable for what Derek Chauvin did. But one of the things that we also realized is that no one's actually trained law enforcement officers until ABLE on how to intervene. And intervening to prevent harm is one of those things that all of us like to think that we'd be really good at, but social science research tells us that we aren't, that people aren't necessarily good at speaking up when they feel like maybe their job is at risk if they say something, or maybe they'll get retaliated against, or maybe they think that they've read the situation incorrectly. Maybe there's not a culture that supports speaking up and saying something in the moment. And so what we did was developed the ABLE project, which is designed to build cultures of active bystandership within law enforcement agencies, and also to provide the skills so folks know how can I intervene in ways that are going to be successful, in ways that are going to be likely to be heard effectively by my colleagues. And over 430 law enforcement agencies across the nation have joined, and and we think that there's been some real impact in those agencies to keep situations from getting out of hand, before they end up escalating.
And we should say that the Seattle Police Department is an ABLE agency. What are some of the best practices that you and your colleagues teach in the ABLE program when it comes to stopping civil rights violations?
Well, the first is that there has to be a cultural commitment at the agency to take it seriously and to know that when people speak up, that they're going to be supported, right? They're not going to be punished. They're not going to be retaliated against, and that there's actually an expectation that you will speak up. And some of that is about the leadership, and some of it is about helping officers reframe how they think about loyalty. Loyalty doesn't need to mean that you have each other's backs even if you're doing something wrong. Loyalty can mean, hey, I'm going to keep you from getting out of hand and save your career, or keep you from getting sued, or keep you from going to jail. And one of the things that we've realized is that officers are really hungry for that. We hear time and time again from folks who have been on the force for decades. This is something that I wish I had learned years ago. Most officers have stories about times where they wish that they had intervened and they didn't, and it sticks with them. And so one of the things that we have thought a lot about, and I think is really relevant to this moment, is that this duty to intervene doesn't just apply to other officers within your jurisdiction. It applies to any law enforcement officer. And that's one of the first things that we started to hear from our agencies this year. Hey, we're starting to see federal law enforcement come in and do illegal things. Does ABLE still apply? And the answer legally is yes, right? Local law enforcement, those officers could be sued for not intervening to prevent harm by federal law enforcement officers. But beyond just being sued, I think a lot of our agencies want to know how to do the right thing. And so one of the things that we're also thinking about is, how can you intervene effectively? Intervening doesn't mean that you have to tackle somebody or grab somebody and arrest them. It can also mean that you just speak up and say something. Hey, buddy, we don't do that here, right? Or you could tap on your body camera and say, hey, whole world's going to be watching this, right? And that there are ways to just slow down those situations and get people to start to think, so that they aren't reacting just in the heat of the moment.
Yeah, the speed at which some of these incidents that have been caught on camera are happening, that idea of slowing down strikes me as, unfortunately not something we saw in the Renee Good situation or the Alex Preddy shooting. What is the consideration, though, for local law enforcement when they are dealing with a totally separate agency that's come to their community? It's one thing to tell your colleague, hey, watch out, we could be treading on difficult territory here, maybe, take a walk around the block, let's cool it for a second. But these are outside agencies that have come to town, in Minnesota, for example, CBP and ICE. What do local law enforcement have to keep in mind? What are they contending with when it comes to trying to protect people's civil rights?
Well, one thing that I would say is it can be difficult to know how to behave in situations that you haven't been placed in before, right? Law enforcement really thrives um, on a degree of consistency, right? You do a traffic stop, you know how that traffic stop is supposed to go, and you're kind of trained for various ways in which that traffic stop can go. I think that what we are seeing right now is, really due to a really unhealthy culture at ICE and CBP and some of these other federal law enforcement agencies. We're not seeing consistency. We're not seeing predictability. And I think that that gives local law enforcement a real challenge as to, what am I supposed to do in this situation? What is my training supposed to tell me about how to deal with this situation? And at the same time, it also means there is a different amount of courage that is involved. And one of the things that we talk about with ABLE is that, most every police officer, when they hear gunshots, they will run in the direction of the gunshots, right? There is a courage there to being a police officer that most people don't have, right? But at the same time, the social science tells us that intervening, speaking up, can feel scarier, right? Especially when you're not used to it. And so we have to help local law enforcement understand how to apply that same courage that they would apply to run towards danger, to find that same courage to be able to speak out in what are going to be unpredictable situations, as long as federal law enforcement continues to act in the way that we've been seeing them act really over the course of this year, Los Angeles and Minneapolis and Chicago, and really across the country.
I've heard Mayor Jacob Frey in Minneapolis talk about the idea of local police, for example, arresting an ICE officer for a violation of somebody's civil rights. And he basically has said, listen, these federal officers, they outnumber our local law enforcement, and they have bigger guns than us. I mean, that's basically what he said. And that indicates that there is a fear about a direct confrontation between local PD, sheriff's departments and local PD and federal agents. I mean, is there a risk, if you talk about the burden, being on the officers to intervene, is there a risk of creating a situation where you would have a direct confrontation?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we teach in ABLE is that there are a variety of ways to intervene, right? And we actually use this framework called PACT: probe, alert, challenge, take action, right? And, probe can be a question. Hey, buddy, are you sure that is that in line with policy? Right. And, alert may be a more of a statement. Hey, I'm pretty sure that's not how we do things. That's not in alignment with policy. Challenge can be, hey, if you keep doing that, I'm going to have to, write up a report or something like that. Right. And so there are ways in which, and then there's take action, right, which might actually mean grabbing somebody and tackling somebody. And an officer is going to have to use their judgment as to what's appropriate at any particular time. I don't recommend necessarily that officers go in and start tackling, federal law enforcement officers, maybe in all but the most, egregious situations. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still effective ways in which local law enforcement can still try to, when they have the opportunity, try to slow things down and try to make sure that, what that officer, if an officer's starting to engage in misconduct, you see somebody losing their temper, you see somebody, and we've all seen the videos, right? You see people cursing, you see people screaming, you see people pulling out pepper spray, threatening, those are all opportunities to intervene before you get to a situation where somebody's pulled out a gun.
Yesterday, Washington State's Attorney General Nick Brown spoke at a press conference, and he was asked a similar question. Basically, what can local law enforcement do during an ICE operation or a CBP operation that is getting out of hand?
I think the Washington public expects their local sheriff or local police chief or officers that work for either to not simply watch if somebody in their community is having their rights violated. We hope we're not ever in that circumstance in Washington state, but I think as a general matter, that is the expectation, if not the duty, that we would anticipate our local forces having.
So not simply watch is what we heard from the Attorney General here. Is he right? I mean, is that in line basically with what you're saying about the duty to intervene?
I think that's exactly right. And what I like about that is he said it's the expectation, which is correct. That's going to be the expectation of the community that you need to police, right? And so if you don't intervene, if you do just stand by and watch, then you're really threatening your relationship with that community. And I would say, he said, if not the duty, and I think it is pretty clearly the legal duty also to intervene. So I think it is both the expectation of the community and the legal duty for officers to intervene when they have the opportunity to do so. And, I think the other thing about that is that interventions aren't always just in the moment, right? And so, I know that the Trump administration has claimed absolute immunity for federal law enforcement. Absolute immunity meaning absolute, that's plainly false under the law, right? I mean, not only can the federal government prosecute federal law enforcement officers who commit illegal acts, but local and state prosecutors can also prosecute federal law enforcement officers who violate state law. And so, if there's an investigation, and that's, by the way, that's not just a murder, right? I mean, we've all seen the videos of, officers pepper spraying people who are pinned to the ground, tear gas being thrown into vehicles with infants, pepper spraying cars who are just driving by. Those are all assaults. And if local prosecutors investigate those assaults and determine that a crime has been committed and issue an indictment, then it's going to be up to the federal government to fight those indictments in court and to claim that there's an immunity that applies. And I think that that's a fight worth having, because it does signal to your community that you're going to be there to protect them. And if you're not willing to have that fight, then it signals the other thing. It signals that you're not going to protect them, and that the federal government ultimately is going to be able to get away with doing whatever they want.
Just circling back to that issue, the courts sound like they are inundated in Minnesota with these lawsuits. Also, the ICE and CBP agents, largely who are conducting these operations, they hide their faces. It's something that certainly local police are not doing when they operate in a community. I suppose before we go, do you have any other reflections about the challenges that local police are facing right now and how they can best protect their communities?
I think that it is really important, as local police are being placed really sometimes between a rock and a hard place, that they're making it clear that they're not just showing up on the scene to protect federal law enforcement from protesters, for example, that they're also showing up to protect protesters from federal law enforcement. And I think with what we've seen from the past several months, that's an explicit thing that we hopefully should hear from law enforcement, right? That it's got to be really, really clear that that's something that they see as a core part of what they're doing.
Tahir Duckett is the executive director of the Center for Innovations in Community Safety at Georgetown Law. And that center runs the ABLE Project, which is a program that teaches local police departments how to intervene during civil rights violations by fellow law enforcement officers. And Tahir, before we go, just double checking, I'm assuming that ICE and CBP, they are not ABLE agencies at this time.
That is correct. They are not ABLE agencies.
Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.